Hello. Now, I know you're a regular listener to David Starkey Talks, you'll be aware that I've often advanced slightly strange first-sight opinions. I've always, of course, tried to back them with evidence. I've claimed, and I think I've supported well, the argument that, judged in his own terms, Putin is not mad, he's just, in our terms, bad. Similarly, I've argued that thanks to the extraordinary intelligence, malign intelligence, again in our terms, of the very long-serving Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, that it's Russia, not us, that's really won the battle for world opinion in the Ukraine crisis. And of course, back in my old field of Tudor studies, I've analysed endlessly the bizarre contradictions of the character of Henry VIII. But I don't think I have ever advanced as apparently an implausible, as wild a claim as I'm about to do now. Indeed, those of you who observe, and not simply what I say, but where I say it carefully, will be aware that what I'm about to say, when I rehearsed, was so shocking that the clock behind me moved forward 5 minutes, and struck 6 o'clock, a rather beautiful chime, for the first time in years. Now, what was it that even moved a mechanical device to action? Well, what I'm going to suggest is, wait for it, that when it comes to the whole business of Partygate, Boris Johnson is telling the truth. Now, I'm aware that almost never have the words Boris and truth been put together without a very powerful negative separating them. But I am going to argue that when Boris says he wasn't aware or didn't think that what he was doing in Downing Street broke the rules, I think we should, well, sort of, I know it's extraordinary thought, we should actually believe him. And I'm going to offer, of course, evidence. In fact, I'm going to offer a lot of evidence. So let's begin. Boris has been fined for his birthday party. That is, he claims, a 10-minute or 9-minute event held in the middle of the day around about lunchtime in Downing Street, in actually the main room in Downing Street, the cabinet room itself, a handsome pillared room which overlooks the garden of Downing Street, away from the street side of Downing Street and looking over Horse Guards Parade. In there was a birthday party for him, of course, on his birthday, which is the 19th of June 2020, when COVID regulations were still very much in force, though it's worth remembering that there was a shifting of tiers, there was a shifting down of degrees of seriousness at this point as the summer months came in. Nevertheless, COVID regulations were still very, very much in force. Johnson is fined, Mrs. Johnson is fined, and to his well-publicised fury, Rishi Sunak is fined also because he turned up early for the meeting, the formal meeting that was going to take place in the cabinet room immediately afterwards, and presumably had a sliver of cake, though emphatically not a drink because he's teetotal, and he was fined for that. So it's a birthday party. It's organised by Carrie Johnson, and she wasn't actually married to him at that point. It's also attended by the famous or infamous Lulu Little, who was in charge of the extraordinarily extravagant and doubtfully paid for decorations in the flat, in the Downing Street flat, in the Prime Minister's flat, which you will remember featured allegedly heavily gilded wallpaper at £800 a roll. So it's not clear whether the birthday cake was actually supplied by Ms. Little and just how much gold leaf was on it. But anyway, these are the by details of history. So it's a birthday party. And who else is there? Well, we actually don't know. We don't know their names, but it's the Downing Street staff. and it's the nature of that staff and their relations with the Prime Minister and their duties towards him that I want to investigate. In other words, what I think we've got wrong about all of this, to start off with, is that the investigation began as an investigation into the behaviour of civil servants in Downing Street. Have you noticed that the only politician in frame is the Prime Minister himself? Nobody else is in question as a politician. It is the Prime Minister's staff that were the original focus of the inquiry. And what I'm going to do in this, I am going to try, against the whole pressure of the current press and media who've been determined to make this a story about Boris, I'm going to say, okay, it is a story about Boris. It is a story about Boris's rule breaking, but it has to be put in context. If you're to understand somebody's behaviour and what they think is right and wrong, you have to look at what other people are doing around them, because that conditions, we all know this, why we put such emphasis on upbringing, why we talk so much when we're trying to understand law breaking and law making and goodness and badness, why we talk so much about environment. So, but let's just go back then. So this is Mr. Johnson, the statements which I am saying I in principle regard as being true. Let's read what he said as the statement immediately after he'd been fined, speaking, of course, as he was, from the relative relaxation of a very different environment to Downing Street, the Prime Minister's country residence at Chequers. Right, this is what the Prime Minister said. Let me say immediately that I have paid the fine, and I once again offer a full apology. He then explained what he'd been doing on the day, that it was a very busy day, that the event was just lasted a few minutes. And he then goes on to say, among all these engagements, on a day that happened to be my birthday, there was a brief gathering in the cabinet room shortly after 2 o'clock, lasting for less than 10 minutes, during which people I worked with, that's the Downing Street staff, the mixture of senior civil servants and senior advisors, political advisors that constitute this inner circle of government, which of course had to keep going during COVID. They couldn't all disappear off and work from home, like many other senior civil servants who, by the way, still haven't gone back to work, which is why you can't get your you can't get your driving license or 9 times 10 any other dealing with the state, because they're all sitting on their pelotons and doing a little bit of dabbling at the computer when the fancy takes them. Anyway, the inner circle of government had to continue working in person with the interpersonal contacts and the team working that is actually required to do something. So, amongst all these engagements, etc., during which the people I work with kindly passed on their good wishes. And I have to say, this is Johnson, and I'm now quoting directly, I have to say in all frankness, at the time, it did not occur to me that this might have been a breach of the rules. Then continues, the necessary caveat, but of course the police have found otherwise, and I fully respect the outcome of their investigations. Right. Mrs. Johnson, now, she spoke through a spokesman. Mrs. Johnson has paid a fixed penalty notice relating to a gathering on the afternoon of the 19th of June 2020, while she believed she was acting in accordance with the rules at the time. Mrs. Johnson accepts the Metropolitan Police Service's findings and apologises unreservedly. Right. Questions were then put to the Prime Minister, and he addressed again, earlier in all of this, when the matter came up in the Commons, he addressed the issue of the nature of that Downing Street staff. He was asked, did he take responsibility for the culture in Downing Street? And he said, I quote again, I take full responsibility for everything. But don't forget that Downing Street is about 15,000 square feet. It's a lot of officials working with hundreds and hundreds of officials. I couldn't be everywhere at once. So it's a very large organisation. Indeed, Sue Gray, the report which was published back in January, on all of this, which actually rather curiously forms the basis of the Metropolitan Police's investigations. She said that Downing Street is now the size of a small government department. In other words, it's the thing that enables the Prime Minister to manage the cabinet and drive forward policy and do all the things that we nowadays expect a quasi-presidential Prime Minister to do. So hundreds of staff, 15,000 square feet. And it's not just Downing Street, because Downing Street, of course, sits at the angle going off Whitehall, and actually, as it were, around the corner in Whitehall is something else that will figure pretty largely in the story that I'm telling now, which is the very handsome building in Whitehall itself. It was originally designed by Sir John Soane at the beginning of the 19th century. He's the great architect of the old Bank of England, of which, alas, only the retaining wall survives. But Soane constructed this handsome pillared building, which was originally designed for the Privy Council and is now the Cabinet Office. And it has the address of 70 Whitehall. And that's where another very important section of the civil service, the actual Cabinet Office itself, as opposed to the Downing Street staff, that's where they are based. It's where the Cabinet Secretary at that point, Mark Sedwell, has his very handsome office. Again, we're going to hear quite a lot about that office in 70 Whitehall, and in and between 70 Whitehall and Downing Street there is a door, but it's an open sesame door, because only people of a certain status have got a pass that takes them between the Cabinet Office, which is a sort of second tier, and the inmost inner sanctum of the Downing Street staff. So this handful can come and go. Now, what do the Downing Street staff do? Well, as I've already said, they're there to advise on policy, they're there to advise on politics, they're there to do this extraordinary range of different things. Everything from foreign policy to, of course, COVID policy. We're going to talk very much indeed shortly about the person who was directly in charge with the grandiose title of Director General of COVID policy. We'll talk about her. By the way, virtually everybody in this story, apart from the Prime Minister, is a her. We are constantly told how wonderful it is to have women in positions of authority and how they all always apparently behave much better than men. The evidence that, again, I'm going to submit perhaps puts the teeniest little scintilla of doubt over the notion that women always behave better than wicked patriarchal men, even somebody as wicked and patriarchal and generally, as naughty as dear old Boris. Right. So there's somebody really to do everything in Downing Street. But the figure that I think we should be focusing on is a person who has a magnificent title. She is, again, then she, actually it's now a he, but we'll ignore it, the holder of the office of Director, wonderful title, of Propriety and Ethics. Now, it's not Essex, it's ethics, propriety and ethics. It's an extraordinary role, isn't it? I suppose it's the equivalent of a walking conscience. It's the slave that appeared, except this is a very well-paid slave. It was a slave that appeared behind the Roman emperor, at a triumph with a little bit of flax, sort of burnt flax. Remember you are mortal, and their job is, the Director of Propriety and Ethics, is essentially to advise everybody, but particularly the Prime Minister, on, of course, the propriety and ethics of government. To hold the Prime Minister, it is said to, let's see if I can find it. Where are we down here now? Here we are, yes. There's a proper definition here. Now, in the Civil Service's own newspaper, the purpose of the propriety and ethics role is to ensure the highest standards of, listen, propriety, integrity and governance within government, right? Propriety, integrity and governance within government. Very, very important, as I said, the role for the upstanding. Interestingly, the first holder of this inflated title was Sue Gray. She is the author of the report into the misgoings-on, into the misgovernance, the impropriety, the breaches of ethics over Partygate that I've been describing now. And she was appointed in 2012 with this there was apparently some sort of role like that before, but it was enhanced. It was given extra status and dignity, I think, to correspond probably with Sue Gray's own importance, or at least her self-importance. She's famously described by Oliver Letwin, of course, who was this strange figure flitting through the government, the coalition government, the 2010-2015 government, the Cameron, the sort of joint operation government with the Lib Dems. Letwin says nothing happened without Sue Gray's approval. So she is a key figure. Anyway, she departs to get higher things, and she is replaced by the person who held this very important role in charge of propriety and ethics and proper behaviour. And she is replaced by a woman called Helen McNamara. And at the time of Partygate, at the time of particularly this first party, which people were to be for attending which people were to be fined, the Prime Minister's birthday party, she was very much in post. Indeed, the post had received yet another boost, because not only was she still in charge of propriety and ethics, she'd actually now been formally titled Deputy Cabinet Secretary. So she's at the level of a permanent secretary in the civil service, which is a very, very distinguished role. Now, this is the woman, and again, this point needs emphasising, and the press has not emphasised it at all. This is the woman, Helen McNamara, whose job was to tell the Prime Minister about the ethics of his behaviour, the propriety of his behaviour, if under any circumstances, for example, on this key issue of attending parties of this extraordinary mixture of work and pleasure. But remember, in some ways, I've already written about this in The Critic, all of this, in some ways, is nonsensical, because Downing Street is both a place where people live, the Prime Minister and his wife, Rishi Sunak at that point, and his wife, and it's also a place of work. So it's not really an office in our modern sense of the term. It is actually a court. It's just really like the court of Henry VIII, and its powers are pretty well identical to that, which is why I write about Downing Street as a court. Anyway, but shunting all that aside. So the person whose job it is to act as the conscience of the Prime Minister and to say to him, Prime Minister, put that birthday cake down. This is breaking the rules. You lot get out of here. This is forbidden under COVID regulation, this, that and the other, People at the time, actually working in the civil service, wrote to Helen McNamara's office and said, can we have a leaving party? And they were told very firmly, no. That's outside the rules. Now, what did Miss McNamara actually do at the Downing Street party on the 9th of December, on the 19th of June? Well, actually, we don't know. But we do know very clearly what she was doing a few hours beforehand, precisely at 3 o'clock in the morning. Indeed, from the evening until 3 o'clock in the morning, Ms. McNamara was in the office of the Cabinet Secretary at the time in 70 Whitehall, that of Mark Sedwell. And what was the head of propriety and ethics doing in the office of the Cabinet Secretary? She was starring in a karaoke party. She apparently, let me just emphasise this, supplied the karaoke machine. The head of propriety and ethics, Helen McNamara, was not only at a party, she supplied a karaoke machine. Can I just gently remind everybody that every singer was pretty well silenced at this point. Covent Garden was dark, church choirs were effectively banned, singing was characterised as this profoundly dangerous activity. You'll remember, COVID is transmitted by airborne droplets, aerosols. And of course, allegedly, when you sing, you send out a lot of aerosols. So singing was effectively a forbidden activity. But the head of propriety and ethics, maybe even organises, certainly heavily features in, supplies the equipment for a karaoke party. And the party takes place, believe it or not, in the office of her immediate boss, Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary. See why Boris might have been a little bit confused, but we haven't finished this story. Let's continue it. We actually know what Mark Sedwell said. Oh, and by the way, Cummings was there at the earlier stage of the party, despite all his affectations of virtue, as indeed was Sedwell himself. Sedwell, as he left his office, said, what did he say? Did he say, really, I'm terribly worried about what you're going to do, you know. We shouldn't really be having a party in these circumstances, should we? You know, the kind of, no doubt put in Sir Humphrey speak. No, he didn't say that. He said, please don't make a mess of my office. Can I repeat? Please don't make a mess of my office. So he knew what sort of party it was going to be. And indeed, a few other things have leaked out too as to exactly what sort of party it was, as seems to have been generally the case in these Downing Street events. It was quote-unquote raucous. In fact, it was so raucous that there were complaints about the noise that it made. And remember, it goes on until 3 o'clock in the morning. Indeed, you know, a thought did strike me, because this is literally just round the corner from Downing Street, sharing garden and everything else. Had Boris actually been kept awake by the party organised, or at least leading participatory role, by the head of propriety and ethics? It's a thought. I mean, you know, if you've heard a party going on all night, you might think that your modest 10-minute birthday party, well, is really, you know, neither here nor there, mightn't you? See what I'm meaning about context? Anyway, let's continue. The raucousness was, of course, caused by consumption of very large amounts of alcohol. I wouldn't really like to have seen the sort of state of Mark Sedwell's office when it was all over, because apparently two people became, in that wonderful old-fashioned phrase, so tired and emotional that they squared up and had to be separated. Now, was the separation done by the head, the Director General of Propriety and Ethics? Don't you think this is rather shocking? That the person in charge of government, the Prime Minister in particular, strictly observing the rules of COVID, was an archbreaker of those rules. Is it any wonder that Boris was confused, that Mrs. Boris, well, she was then his girlfriend, Carrie Simmons, was confused? I don't think it is. I think, in fact, we should be asking very hard questions of Helen McMahon. She has, of course, released a 2-line statement, you know, terribly sorry I've admitted the fine. And why, actually? Isn't it interesting? Why only do we know about her fine so far and one other civil service fine? We do because Helen McNamara and the other woman, let's not name her yet, but let's give her office, the Director General of the COVID Task Force, in other words, the person who actually made the rules. The reason that we know that they've been fined, they of course sail into high-level jobs elsewhere, and Miss McNamara, having been, you know, Deputy Cabinet Secretary and in charge of propriety and ethics, is now, well, an organisation that I think needs quite a lot of propriety and ethics. She's in charge of policy and corporate affairs at, wait for it, the Premier League. And interestingly, she's still in post. I wonder what all those soccer fans whose games were suspended and everything else think about that. So that is, in my view, the utterly disgraceful role that is played by the woman whose principal job it was to keep the Prime Minister on the straight and narrow. She is an arch-breaker of the rules. Which, of course, raises the entire question about the rules themselves. As I said, the rules themselves are the responsibility as it were, the administrative oversight, drafting and everything else of those rules is the responsibility of this other official, again, that we know has been fined. She is called Kate Josephs. And she was the Director General of the COVID Task Force. She, at the very end of 2020, again sails on to another very important job as CEO, as Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council. Again, very, very well paid job, paid much more than the Prime Minister. She leaves, of course she's perfectly entitled to leave, but the person who had been in charge of actually setting the rules, how does she leave? With, a regretful, of course not a handshake, you couldn't possibly do that, could you, at the time? An elbow bump, and carefully distanced 2-meter wave to her friends, as she sort of bids a tearful farewell on the 17th of December 2020, when, interestingly enough, the rules, as I said, round about 18th, 19th of June, the rules were being relaxed. But around the 17th of January, the 17th of December 2020, the rules were being intensified. London was going from Tier 2 to Tier 3 to Tier 4. How does Kate Joseph celebrate her leaving the Cabinet Office? Again, the Cabinet Office, 70 Whitehall, by, believe it or not, having a party which is described as a boozy party, with, again, considerable disturbance and mess. This is the woman who had actually presided over the drawing up of the rules which Boris Johnson is accused of breaking. The woman who actually draws up the rules, supervises the work of making them so minute and preposterous and absolutist, is a leading breaker of those rules. Let me just repeat that. The woman who had actually formulated the rules takes a leading part in breaking the rules at exactly the moment when the rules are being tightened and in fact turned into a noose which will kill everybody else's Christmas. She has a raucous, drunken party in her own working space, whether it's her own office or again, Sedwell's is unclear at this point, in 70 Downing Street. I repeat, is it 70 Whitehall? I repeat, is it any wonder Boris was confused when all of these people who have huge salaries, vast pensions, rejoice in inflated titles, have the job of drawing up these rules? We've got into this habit of thinking it's only the politicians who break the rules. The civil servants all read The Guardian, have right-on opinions, upright and upstanding, are generally sort of written about in laudatory terms by the BBC. Actually, the rule breakers are the civil servants. These two people that we're talking about now, these are not political advisors. These are not wicked Tories. I would guess, of course, if you actually look at them, that they will all be absolutely upstanding Labour voting, subscribe to the whole doctrine of woke and probably wave their pronouns around as well. They broke the rules. They flagrantly, with apparently no shame, broke the rules. And when they apologise, they do so only at the moment they're about to be exposed, because again, they've moved on from the civil service. So shall we just listen to the statement from Keith Josephs? I'm a line, great statesman, from Kate Josephs. Keith Joseph would never have done that. Anyway, as people know, I previously worked in, this is needless to say with a tweet, as people know, I previously worked in the Cabinet Office COVID Task Force, where I worked in it. She was Director General until the 18th of December 2020. I have been cooperating fully with the Cabinet Office investigations, and I do not wish to preempt the finding of the investigation. However, as Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, I am responsible for leading the organisation and working with partners across the city and region to support our COVID response and recovery. That is why I've decided to make a statement. On the evening of the 17th of December, I gathered with colleagues that were that day at work with drinks in our office in the Cabinet Office to mark my leaving the civil service. I am truly sorry I did this, and for the anger that people will feel as a result. Sheffield has suffered greatly during this pandemic, and I apologise unreservedly. The specific facts of this event will be considered in the context of the Cabinet Office investigation. I did not attend any events in 10 Downing Street. I am grateful for the ongoing support of colleagues and partners and need now to ask that people allow the Cabinet Office to complete its investigation. I will not be able to respond to any further questions until the Cabinet Office investigation is complete. She was fined. It was a flagrant breach of the rules by the person that had overseen the writing of them. Again, I put the question. If that is the case, is it not perfectly clear why Johnson thought, having participated in very modest breaches of the rules, it would seem, that he was okay? Now, I know Johnson should have known the rules in detail. If it had been Margaret Thatcher, she would have been able to recite them chapter and verse and say exactly when each word had been changed and on which date, because she was a detail person as well as a big vision person. Johnson isn't. I'm not even sure he's got a big vision. But anyway, he's big picture person. That's why you have the Downing Street staff. That's why you have this apparatus, as Johnson himself said, the 15,000 people and the several hundred staff. Those staff, it is perfectly clear, at least the leaders of the staff, the Director General of Propriety and Ethics, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, the Director General of the COVID Task Force, and clearly both people who were in office as Cabinet Secretary, Sedwell himself and his successor, Simon Case, who had to recuse himself from the investigation because he had been attending these parties. All of them betray their functions. None of them remonstrate with the Prime Minister. Now, people will say, how do you know? I don't know. But can I put forward a challenge now? Would any civil servant who feels, any member of the Downing Street staff, political or civil service, that feels that I have traduced them, I will always accept evidence. Why don't they put into the public domain now what on earth is to stop them? A minute that they wrote, a remonstrance that they made. Civil servants tend to take notes, even if they just spoke orally. If they just made an intervention, said, really, should we be doing this? They will have kept a note. Put those in the public domain. Otherwise, you are to blame. And dare I say it, you led the Prime Minister astray. And he is now paying the penalty for that. Because we all take behaviour from context. We all take behaviour from context. Now, there's a final little addition to all of this, which is, of course, that Helen McMahon and Kate Josephs were given honours in the 2021 honours list. Well, not the actual New Year's honours, the birthday honours list. They were both made Commanders of the Order of the Bath for public service. Part of Helen McNamara's job as head of propriety and ethics was supervising the removal of honours from people who have misbehaved and brought the honours system into disrepute. And she held forth on this subject very extensively in, I think it was 2018, to at the time of the Professor Alexis, let's get the word right, Alexis Jay's inquiry into child abuse. She holds forth extensively on the criteria by which honours are removed, hard and soft triggers, and seems really pretty enthusiastic for this process. I wonder what we all feel about the head of propriety and ethics who so conspicuously broke the fundamental rule of the time, the observance of the COVID rules? What do we feel about her walking away with a rather significant decoration, a wonderful term, rather significant honour for public service, when she betrayed the public service and the Prime Minister so conspicuously? What do we feel about an honour for the head of the Director General? Mere head is not good enough. The Director General of the COVID task force, who trashed the rules at exactly the point that they were being intensified for everybody else by having a boozy leaving party. What do we feel about her getting an honour too? There's, of course, a machinery by which you can petition to have the honours removed. There is a thing called the Forfeiture Committee. It is based at 1 Horse Guards Road, and if you feel like writing about it, absolutely fine. I think all this is tiresome, attempt at a kind of imposition of the office of a censor. It's like, the Roman Republic, when we're all supposed to observe, preposterous rules of honour and whatever. But of course, you do feel a little bit like doing it, don't you, with a woman who'd actually been in charge of this process, Helen McMahon, who was wanting to, it would appear, extend it, who was wanting to hold other people to rules that she doesn't observe herself. So, the business of Boris and the rule breaking, and Rishi Sunak and his minuscule rule breaking, are much more complicated than they've been presented. The simple focus on the politicians does them, and I know we don't like doing politicians justice, but I think it does them a severe injustice. We need to look at the rot in the heart of government itself, not government in the terms of politics, but government in the terms of administration, the astonishing degree of entitlement and of arrogance which characterises them.